My name is Peter Neofotis, and welcome to the first episode of TheWooh-Wooh-ist. What Woo-Woohism is this fundamental belief system that's not meant to take the place of your current religious belief system or your lack thereof, but really to sort of complement it. And what we as Woo-Woohists believe is there seems to be some spiritual force which counteracts the second law of thermodynamics. And for those of you who don't know, the second law of thermodynamics basically states that as time marches on, the disorder in the universe typically increases. That's why if you don't clean your room or do anything, you will still seem to lose your socks and things like that. Anyway, what we as Woo-Woohists recognize, though, is there seems to be some instances where strange coincidences happen which don't involve work, right? They just seem to bring things together in these wonderful ways. And we'd like to recognize them. We think that that's some sort of proof of something out there. I've had lots of woo-woo things happen to me, and I wanted to talk about some of them in hopes that you will talk about yours as well. One of the strangest woo-woo incidents that ever happened to me actually begins in 2007. Around November, well, I think on Veterans Day, there was an article published in the New York Times about a man named Frank Buckles, who the article was stating was the last American veteran of the Great War. And the article was very poignant, and it talked about how with the death of Frank Buckles, a lot of the memory of World War I would be lost forever. The memory and the history that we could really touch and talk to someone who'd actually served in some capacity in the European theater. And it was also a rather sad article because it talked about how after World War I, the veterans that came home, even though 100,000 Americans died in that conflict, they weren't really treated with much fanfare or even respect. There was no GI Bill for World War I veterans. Instead, they were just greeted by, Prohibition and then, the Great Depression, right? So it was a rather poignant article, and it dealt, I thought, a lot with memory. And so I printed it out, and I told myself that one day I'd love to write a story about World War I and memory. And I didn't know what the story would take place or how it would take place, but I knew somehow I wanted to do this story. So I printed the article out and put it in a manila envelope and placed it on my desk, waiting for a story to come to me. And it remained on my desk for about 3 years. It wasn't until I then, in 2010, was a featured performer in the Theater of the American South festival, which takes place in Wilson, North Carolina, which is this wonderful town in Eastern Carolina where all the tobacco in the South used to be traded. And they put on this festival every year, and they invited me to come down and tell stories for a month. And while I was down there, I met a folk artist named Vollis Simpson, who had been in World War II, served in North Africa, I believed, and then been a mechanic for much of his life. And then after he retired from being a mechanic, decided he didn't want to sit around and do nothing with the rest of his life. So he started building these giant whirligigs on his farm, which were these giant windmills made out of scrap metal and old car parts that he painted in these bright, colorful ways. And they whirled in the breeze, and they were huge. And that in itself was spectacular. But even more spectacular is that they sent, through a series of sprockets and gears into locomotion, a series of figurines, which were also mounted on the structures. And these figurines would dance in the breeze. And it was an incredible thing to see these structures, right? And he had grown to some folk art fame. Some photographer had been sort of driving through the South and seeing them and taking a photo of them years prior to my seeing them, and those photos were published in the New York Times. And so he was famous at this point. But when I saw them, it was the same experience. My host in North Carolina just took me down this old country road. We run around a corner, and then there in the middle of nowhere were these giant windmills made out of scrap metal. And I met Vollis, and he was an incredible old man in his 90s, huge hands, still welding, and I just thought wait, this is my World War One story, even though he was in World War Two. He looked so mighty that I figured he could live to be 120. And I thought whirligigs were a great symbol also of the birth of the modern age, which is also what World War One is, right? Because these are giant machines and they use wind, and World War One was the first conflict where airplanes were employed in large scale. So I went home thinking I would write a story about World War One and incorporate these whirligigs into them. And I did some more research, and over Christmas of that year, I wrote the first draft out by hand of the whirligigs. And it took me some time to then go back to that first draft and actually type it out. Partly because that's an intimidating experience. You know, you write something out by hand and you think it's really good, but you're sort of scared to read it because you don't really necessarily want to see all the flaws in it, right? But around the end of February of that year in 2010, I became filled with this overwhelming urge to write out or type out my full draft of the whirligig so I could see it. And it kept on growing and growing. And finally, toward the end of February, this like overwhelming spiritual urge just hit me. And I felt like I had to type that story out like now, and I could wait no longer. So I came home from work and I grabbed my notes, I sat on my computer, and I told myself I wasn't going to get up until I finished. I mean, I'd go to the bathroom, but I wouldn't like go anywhere or do anything. I was just going to type the story like all night. I wasn't going to go to bed. And it was a strange night in New York. It was a winter night, but it was like there was a storm going on. And I remember it being like muggy or something. And I was just sitting at my desk and I was typing and I was typing and I was typing. And I was overcome with this like spiritual force. But something told me I had to get this story out now. I could wait no longer. And if I didn't stop, if I stopped and I put it away, I'd lose the thread and the whole story would be lost for me forever. So I kept typing, it kept typing. It got later and later and later, but I kept on going. Nothing was stopping me, even though I got very tired. And finally around 5 a.m., I wrote the last line and I collapsed into my bed. And I was relieved that this had been finally exorcised from me. And the next day, I woke up feeling relieved, but almost in a state of delirium because I hadn't slept well. And the radio turned on. And I don't know if I turned the radio on or if it was my radio alarm clock, but somehow the radio turned on. And the first thing I heard was on NPR. Frank Buckles, the last survivor of World War I, died last night. And I just remember chills going up my spine. Because, you know, sometimes strange things happen to you, but like you're not quite sure that the thing you're connecting it with actually did happen. But like my notes were right on my desk. Like I know what had happened to me the night before. Like I had had this strange spiritual fit and I had to finish writing this story. So that was there. And as I then walked over to my desk and pulled out of the manila envelope the article about Frank Buckles, the newscaster started talking about 3 years ago, there was an article written about Frank Buckles in the New York Times, and the article talked about how he was likely going to die that year, but he didn't. He ended up living 3 years longer and outliving the European survivors of the conflict, and he was indeed the last doughboy standing of the Great War. And I couldn't, you know, I mean, there was a woman who was still alive who was in World War I. I think her name is Florence Green. She had somehow served in in the British Air Force in some capacity. And there was an Australian man who had served in the Navy in Australia. But yeah, no one else was left. The story gets a little stranger because then in 2013, I was invited back to Wilson, North Carolina, again to be another featured performer at the Theater of the American South Festival. And at this time, I had a pretty good draft of the whirligigs written. And in the whirligigs, it's about an old man who's about 120, who's the last survivor of World War I, and he can't die. And it's sort of a merging of Vollis Simpson and Frank Buckles. And the story takes place in the South in May. And at the end of the story, the old man sort of comes to peace with these ghosts of World War I and passes away. And while I was down in Wilson in May that year, in 2013, Vollis Simpson also passed away. So yeah, that's a woo-woo thing that happened to me. I'm sure you have some woo-woo stories as well. I'd love to hear them, so I'll put my contact information at the end of this cast. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.